SpaceX might be ready to fly Starship very soon. Vast shows off a final design for its upcoming space station. PLD Space unveils an ambitious plan for the next decade. And a supermassive black hole keeps eating stars. All that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. This week, as Hurricane Milton swept across the southeastern United States, NASA and NOAA were hard at work tracking the powerful storm from above. Satellite imagery from GO-16 and photos taken from the ISS showcased the massive scale and structure of Milton. And it was truly massive. At its peak, Milton clocked in at a rare Category 5 hurricane, and it also ranked as the 5th most intense Atlantic hurricane in recorded history. What's more, it's the fastest hurricane on record to intensify to a Cat 5 in the Gulf of Mexico. Throughout the week, NASA astronaut Matthew Dominic also posted a series of stunning time-lapses from onboard the International Space Station showing the storm's progression prior to it making landfall. Multiple teams at NASA were tracking Milton as it progressed across the Gulf of Mexico. NASA's Earth Observatory used multiple data sources to track Milton's progress. Some data came from several NASA and NOAA satellites, which are outfitted with moderate-resolution imaging spectroradiometer, or MODIS, and visible infrared imaging radiometer suite, or VIIRS, instruments. To estimate rainfall at the surface, the Earth Observatory employed an algorithm called NASA's Integrated Multi-Satellite Retrievals for GPM, or iMERGE for short. This combines information from the International Global Precipitation Measurement to estimate precipitation over the majority of the Earth's surface. Additionally, NASA's Short-Term Prediction Research and Transition Project, or SPORT, based at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, mapped sea surface temperatures throughout the week, highlighting those above 82 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 27.8 degrees Celsius, and also the temperature generally considered to fuel hurricanes. This team compiles an amalgamation of satellite sensor data with the goal of improving weather predictions by studying trends and anomalies. SPORT then makes the information available to experts and the public. This real-time data was crucial for local authorities and emergency responders as they prepared for the hurricane's landfall. In an effort to assist those in Milton's path and those previously affected by Hurricane Helene, SpaceX enabled basic texting services via Starlink's direct-to-cellular service on compatible T-Mobile phones. The company was given emergency temporary approval to activate the service using the more than 100 direct-to-cell satellites currently in orbit. It was noted that since the full constellation has not yet been fully deployed, the services would be delivered on a best-effort basis. As the storm raged towards Florida, many in the state also reported a peculiar phenomenon. The sky appeared to turn a vibrant purple color. This can occur due to the scattering of light by the storm's moisture and particles in the atmosphere, creating stunning but definitely somewhat eerie visuals. While the imagery resulting from hurricanes like Milton are often awe-inspiring, we of course are also mindful of their devastating impact. All of us here at NSF hope that those in the wake of Milton and Helene remain safe and have a resilient and quick recovery. This week, Spanish launch company PLD Space announced a really ambitious plan for its next decade. Prior to the announcement, PLD invited NSF to get a first look at those plans and what's being done to make them a reality. Let's hear about those plans straight from Alex himself, who was the one that made that visit.
Well, first of all, I have to thank PLD Space for the invitation, and wow, there's a lot to unpack here, so I'm gonna start from the top. This week marked PLD Space's 1-year anniversary since the first launch of their Miura 1 rocket. This rocket, which we covered last year, was the company's suborbital technology demonstrator, so essentially it was their testbed for the technologies they use on future rockets. That launch was a success and it met all of the company's main objectives, so what better way to celebrate the anniversary of said testbed for future rockets than by talking about said future rockets. Prior to the event, we were given a presentation and a tour of the new headquarters and the factory. There we were told by company officials that their timeline can be split sort of in 3 main parts: the now, the new, and the next. The now is all about their upcoming rocket, Miura 5, which they already had announced many years ago and is now finally in production. This rocket is a relatively small rocket with a 1-ton to low Earth orbit capability, with a first stage that can parachute down to the ocean for recovery and reuse. Small note, while that sounds a lot like Rocket Lab's Electron, PLD Space had proposed this type of reuse many years before Rocket Lab. It's just that, well, let's say that there's a bit of a gap in funding and progress between both companies. We'll get to that later. The new, however, is that they plan to upgrade the Miura 5 rocket in order to be able to perform propulsive landing. This is not somewhat new, as I recall the company had actually talked about similar plans ages ago when all was in very early planning stages, so this seemed kinda natural. The company's CEO, Raul Torres, said that just like Miura 1 demonstrated technologies for Miura 5, the upgraded Miura 5 will test the technologies for their follow-on rocket. That's when the next comes into play, and literally, because they call their follow-on rocket Miura Next. Miura Next is essentially a bigger version of Miura 5 with more powerful engines, and its first stage is also reusable with propulsive landing. But not happy with all of that, the company said, what if we strap 2 or even 4 more boosters to the side of the rocket? Well, that's the Miura Next Heavy and the Miura Next Super Heavy. As you can see, their naming choices were very straightforward. With this family of rockets, PLD Space hopes to cover all market needs, present and future. With Miura Next, they can go up to 13 tons to low Earth orbit, and with the heavy and super heavy variants, they can cover up to 30 and 53 tons to low Earth orbit respectively. But not happy enough with unveiling this family of rockets, I mean completely out of the blue, the company went one step further and announced what is beyond. PLD Space announced its Luinstra project, which will see the development of a reusable space capsule to transport cargo and crew into orbit. In cargo configuration, it will be able to carry 5 tons into orbit and carry about 3.5 down to Earth. In crew configuration, it could fly 4 to 5 people, depending how many you want to carry. By the way, Luinstra means links in Spanish. Apparently, it's because when they were launching Miura 1, their launch site is in a natural reserve, and there's a lot of links out there. So that's how they came up with that name. It's the name of the project, not the capsule. The company even surprised us with showing off a low confidence test article. It's not a mock-up, it's not like cardboard or anything, it's an actual vehicle that they built. It's just low confidence test article, and they unveiled it at the event. PLD Space hopes to complete a higher fidelity test article in the coming months to test parachute drop testing in 2025. Later down the line, the hope is to perform pad aboard and in-flight aboard tests to test the capsule's escape system, which will be a bit more traditional with a launch escape tower. I know, I'm mostly sure that a lot of people are in the comments, this is not realistic or whatever. Now, all of these plans are great and all, but is there any chance they could become real? Well, so far the company says it has raised over 150 million euros, and it has enough money to run up to the end of 2026 with no further fundraising. When I was given the presentation prior to the event, one of the company officials told us they think it'll take 700 million euros to develop the Miura Next family and the crew capsule. And well, let's say I'm highly skeptical of that. They probably will need about 4 to 5 times that amount of money. Just to put this in perspective, the stubby version, the first version of Falcon 9, was developed for about $400 million. Yeah, and that doesn't count all of the upgrades for usability. It doesn't count Crew Dragon. Like, we're essentially seeing a company trying to develop something that is a little bit like Falcon and a little bit like Dragon with a lot less money. Yeah. The timelines are also super aggressive. The first flight of Miura 5 is looking like it won't be until at least early 2026, and they want to debut the Miura Next rocket and the crew capsule both on the same flight by 2030. Later down the line, the heavy and super heavy versions will come up eventually 2 or 3 years down the line. And they also plan the same thing for the capsule to go from cargo to crew also in a few years, essentially 2 or 3 years after. Needless to say, all of this is really ambitious, but as a European who's tired of silly timelines and no innovation at all, I gotta tell you, we need ambition. We need more companies willing to go fast and aim high, and over-promising and under-delivering is better than just not delivering at all. One thing that we do want to be delivered though is Starship, which may fly this week. Remember last week's episode when Elysia started it like this?
And is Starship's next launch less than 10 days away?
Well, it turns out it might indeed be less than 10 days after last week's episode, or in other words, this weekend. In that episode, Ryan talked about an impending launch date for Starship's 5th flight based on a local notice to mariners, and right after that episode, we had a lot more airspace and marine notices being released. Then, a few days later, we finally got SpaceX SpaceX itself confirming that the company was targeting this Sunday, October 13th, for the 5th flight of Starship. As usual with these official announcements, always comes a lot of official information about what's gonna happen during the flight. In very simple terms, the mission plan is very similar to the previous ones. Go up over the Gulf of Mexico, fly into space, re-enter, and be done. Now, of course, that is in very, very simple terms. Over the different 4 previous flights, a lot of things have changed, and so for this flight, of course, we have the catch. This will be the first time that the SpaceX will be recovering a super heavy booster, in this case booster 12, and it will be returning back to Starbase. Returning back to the launch site a 17-meter tall and 9-meter diameter vehicle like Super Heavy implies SpaceX will have to have a few more extra steps to return it back to the launch site. As the company has announced on its website, the default profile for this mission is actually a splashdown, and the booster will not come back to the launch site unless the health checks on both the booster and the tower confirm that both are good for a catch. Furthermore, the flight director will need to manually confirm that everything is go for a catch before the boost back burn ends. I gotta say, I do hope that there's some kind of go no go poll while the boost back burn is ongoing so that we can hear it or something. That will be great, SpaceX. But if indeed everything is go for the catch, we're gonna have quite the show. The launch window opens at 7 AM Central, that is 1200 UTC, and that is about half an hour before sunrise, which means by the time of the catch, the sun is not even gonna be out, so it's gonna be quite amazing to see that. In preparation for this catch, SpaceX has been doing a lot of upgrades to not just the launch pad itself, but also for the booster as well. In order to be prepared for the catch, SpaceX had to upgrade the chopsticks. We've seen, for example, that they have upgraded the hydraulic systems in order for the chopsticks themselves to be able to close fast. I mean, the last thing that you want is for the booster to actually be dead on center and then the chopsticks not closing. Kind of feels like that's an important thing to have. Another set of upgrades that we have seen as well has been the reinforcement of essentially every single weld on the chopsticks. They got reinforcements, doublers, and all, you name it. They had B14.1, which was a test tank simulating the methane tank of a booster. And well, let's say that they went a bit above and beyond with the slab testing, essentially trying to see how fast the chopsticks could close. They also tested the compression of the landing rails. They tested a bunch of stuff essentially. Now all of that work is for the booster side of things. The ship will also try to do something very similar to Ship 29. But if you remember, Ship 29 didn't have a perfect re-entry. Well, it did indeed go down to the Indian Ocean and soft splashdown and everything. Well, let's say that I bet those flaps wanted bit more protection, and that's what they have done for Ship 30. Between flights 4 and 5, SpaceX essentially revamped and overhauled the heat shield system on Ship 30. The nearly 18,000 thermal tiles that the ship has were replaced by newer and tougher ones. SpaceX also added a new ablative material underneath of the tiles in large portions of the ship. That is so that if the tiles were to fall off or get damaged or whatever, then there's at least a secondary heat shield that can help not melt everything essentially. So that's the plan for the next launch of Starship. Fly the whole thing, catch the booster, do a ship re-entry that doesn't actually melt the vehicle. Seems kind of intuitive, right? Since SpaceX's announcement that this launch is going to be on October 13th, the company has destacked Ship 30 from Booster 12 and has installed the flight termination system on both vehicles. Right now, we are actually waiting for those vehicles to be restacked again because they are seemingly ready to go. See, there they are. That's the ship. It's waiting for a full stack. Come on, SpaceX. Lift it. So with that in mind, does that mean that we're gonna see a flight this Sunday, October 13th? Well, there's still one thing that's missing. So with all of that complete, what's left ahead? Of course, there's that stacking that I just mentioned, but also the FAA launch license. As of right now, Friday morning, there's no launch license in sight. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't come out from here, until the launch happens. In fact, it normally is that we tend to see that license come out either the day before or a couple of days before the launch happens. So we still have time, we still have a few more days ahead until that launch license can come out. So although we may not feature that on this episode, there's still a chance that maybe later today on Countdown to Launch or maybe tomorrow we'll feature that as well. As always, you can keep track of all of the updates here at NSF on this channel. And now back to Elysia.
Thanks, Alex. That'll certainly be an exciting and interesting flight. Now let's take a look at some other interesting stories that happened across space, starting with Impulse Space. The company, founded by Tom Mueller, has recently been awarded multiple contracts from the United States Space Force. One contract includes 2 missions involving the company's Miura space tug. For one mission, the vehicle will stay in low Earth orbit, but for the other, Miura will operate in geosynchronous transfer orbit. What the vehicles will do there is still unclear, but the purpose of the missions is to demonstrate how, quote, pre-positioned capabilities can improve responsiveness to on-orbit situations. The Miura in geosynchronous transfer orbit will be brought there on Impulse's Helios kick stage. The company also recently announced via X that it's getting ready to test the first engine for that vehicle. The other contract is for a 90-day feasibility study into on-demand space vehicle deorbit. This was awarded by the Space Force's Space Development Agency, which has also contracted other companies to perform similar studies. This week, the Dominican Republic became the 44th country to sign the Artemis Accords, which are, as the name suggests, related to NASA's Artemis program. All of the countries that signed the Artemis Accords agree on a set of principles for the peaceful exploration of the Moon, Mars, and even asteroids and comets. While the Dominican Republic doesn't really have any spaceflight history, the country has recently shown interest in space. Earlier this year, the country's National Intelligence Directorate announced a collaboration with the Florida-based company Launch on Demand to study the feasibility of constructing a commercial spaceport in the country. So, if everything works out, the Dominican Republic might be awaiting their own bright future in space. A supermassive black hole 215 million light-years away has been gobbling up stars. In a study published this week, astronomers used NASA's Chandra X-ray Observatory and the Hubble Space Telescope to digest this black hole's eating habits. When a star gets too close to a black hole, it's torn apart by the black hole's immense tidal forces and gravitational pull. These events are known to astronomers as tidal disruption events, and in 2019, a telescope in California detected the burst of light that resulted from one of these events related to this particular black hole. But that wasn't the only thing that scientists noticed. The black hole also emits a burst of X-rays roughly every 48 hours. With the observations from Chandra and Hubble, the astronomers determined that the size of the disk around the black hole had grown as a result of the tidal disruption event in 2019. And it's now large enough that another star or a smaller black hole orbiting the supermassive black hole can collide with this disk. These collisions would then result in the observed X-ray bursts. So this black hole might have devoured a star only recently, but it seems like its next meal is already being served. VAST showed off the final design of its upcoming Haven 1 space station. Haven 1 is a single-module space station that the company plans to launch next year. The small commercial space station is set to function as a pathfinder for the much larger stations that VAST is planning. One notable change compared to previous renders of Haven 1 is the location of the station's big domed window. It was previously located at the end of the station, but it's now been moved to the side of a big multifunctional space. To get to this design, VAST turned to Peter Russell Clark, a former industrial designer at Apple. But to ensure that Haven 1 works as a functional orbital outpost, the company also took advice from former NASA astronaut Andrew Feustel. The design is characterized by the use of wood, an uncommon material in space station design. Compared to the International Space Station, Haven 1's interior looks very clean and free of clutter. Of course, the ISS has been lived in for well over 2 decades, so it remains to be seen if Haven 1 will stay this tidy after a few missions. Now let's take a look at all the space traffic this week and see what's coming up next week in spaceflight. Starting off the week on October 7th, we had the launch of the European Space Agency's Hera mission. The launch vehicle for this mission was a Falcon 9, and it was the first Falcon 9 mission since the anomaly with Crew 9's second stage re-entry. The investigation into this anomaly is still ongoing, and most Falcon 9 missions have been on hold until that investigation is completed. So why was this mission allowed to fly? Well, Hera was launched into a heliocentric orbit, and that mission profile means that Falcon 9's second stage didn't re-enter Earth's atmosphere. With no re-entry in the mission plan, the FAA concluded that the risk was sufficiently mitigated and authorized the mission. The high amount of energy required for this mission also meant that the booster for this flight had to be expended, and thus B-1061 ended its career of 23 flights. Among those missions were Crew 1, Crew 2, CRS-23, and 10 Starlink missions. With Hera on board, the booster lifted off from Space Launch Complex 40 at the Cape for one final time. The spacecraft is now on its way to asteroid Didymos and its moon Dimorphos. And if those names sound familiar, that's because the two were also the destination of NASA's Double Asteroid Redirection Test, or DART. That mission changed Dimorphos's orbit by colliding with the Moon in September of 2022. Hera is set to arrive at the system in late 2026. Once there, it will study the asteroids in more detail and investigate the impact made by the previous visitor. Later in the week, on October 10th, we had a Changzheng 3B launch from China. The launch was conducted from the Xichang Satellite Launch Center, with liftoff occurring at 1350 UTC. The rocket delivered its payload into a geostationary transfer orbit, but not much is known about the payload. We do know that this is the third in a series of satellites with a name that translates to Satellite Internet High Orbit. Going into next week, we'll have the return of Crew 8. The crew of 4 was supposed to return from the ISS last week, but their departure from the station was delayed due to Hurricane Milton. The crew of 4 is currently set to depart the station on October 13th at 7:05 Universal Time. However, that schedule might change again depending on the weather conditions in the splashdown zone off the coast of Florida. That same day, we're also expecting the 5th flight of Starship and Super Heavy. The big shiny rocket is currently scheduled to lift off from the launch pad in Texas during a 1 hour and 10-minute window starting at 12 o'clock UTC. And as Alex told you earlier in this episode, it promises to be an exciting flight. And to make that day even more exciting, SpaceX is also planning to launch Europa Clipper. NASA's long-awaited mission to Jupiter's moon Europa is set to launch atop a fully expendable Falcon Heavy on October 13th at 1612 UTC from Launch Complex 39A in Florida. Like Hera, this mission is also not affected by the investigation into the second stage anomaly. Not only does Clipper's second stage not re-enter, it's also a NASA-licensed mission, which means that SpaceX won't need FAA approval to fly. But the company does need approval for its next mission. If SpaceX gets it, we'll have a Starlink mission on October 14th. This mission is set to lift off from the Cape during a 4-hour window opening at 5:48 Universal Time. Another Starlink mission is also scheduled for the next day, October 15th. This flight is set to launch from California, with liftoff scheduled during a 4-hour window starting at 8:03 UTC. But like the previous Starlink flight, this is all pending regulatory approval. Just a few hours later, we'll have a launch from China. A Changzheng 6A is set to lift off from the Taiyuan Satellite Launch Center at 11:25 UTC. The payload for this mission is currently unknown. And wrapping up the week, China is expected to launch another unknown payload roughly 12 hours later. This time, a Changzheng 4C is set to launch from the Zhoushan Satellite Launch Center at 23:45 UTC. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF, and I'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.